Our brains are very interesting. Some of you already know that your brain is very interesting. But this organ that controls our nervous system, this organ controls our nervous system. Scientists for years and years have been changing over decades, trying to study of how our brains store information, how we remember certain things. It was said that your brain was like a big filing cabinet, that you had different drawers and different folders that information would go into, and it was like your brain would go into this filing cabinet, pull it out, and retrieve information. I don't know if you have a filing cabinet in your office, but I'm not very good at organization, so when I hear that, I'm like, my brain must be awful. And so, it's like, that just doesn't resonate with me. And then it became that our minds were kind of like a supercomputer, like a memory card that was formatted between our skull, that it was just like this one little spot in our brain that all information was. And then now more recently, what they've discovered is that it is actually a lot more difficult and much more complex than that. The way that we store information is not just one part of the brain, but to remember is a process that takes multiple parts of the brain for us to come together at one moment and 1 millisecond for you to remember something. Example would be this: if you were to get on a bike, I don't know how long it's been since you've ridden a bike, but it's been a while for me. But if you were to get on a bike, your mind is going to help you remember how to ride that bike. Your mind from one part of the brain is going to say, this is how you ride a bike. Another part of the brain is going to tell you, this is how you get from one part of the street to the other side of the street. And then a different part of the brain is going to tell you that this is bike safety, that you look before you cross the street, that you don't turn too sharp, so you don't flip over the handlebars. Now, all that's happening in one moment, in 1 millisecond, for us just to ride a bicycle. It's no wonder that some of us lose our keys and can't remember names, right? Names, that one's for me because I'm horrible with names. I've tried to work on it. I met our new neighbors a couple of weeks ago, and I even tried the trick where you repeat the name like 3 times in the conversation. You know those tricks? They tell you, like, have them repeat the name, you repeat the name, and it's like, this is going to help you remember names. And then as I was telling him bye, I called him by the wrong name, and he thought I was joking with him. And I was like, no, that's just me, man. Sorry, I'll get it, I promise. Our brains are fascinating. How we remember things, and sometimes it's a challenge. You have online passwords that you have to remember. You ever gone to sign into your iTunes account? No one remembers that password, right? You're like, I set this up like 10 years ago. I don't even know what I was doing at the time, what was important in that moment. You have that kind of information. You have passwords that get on your devices. There's a lot to remember in our world today, especially with all the technology that we have. Now they've created apps where you can put all your information into one app. But the problem is you have to remember the password to get into that app. Some of you know that, right? There's a lot that comes with faith when it comes to remembering as well. If you memorize or remember scripture, which is a great practice to do, that as you're going through your day, you can have the Lord recall scriptures into your mind that help the situation that you're following through. Or if you grew up in a traditional church or maybe an older church, you would have probably, in the front of the sanctuary, you'd probably had a table that on the front of it was etched in remembrance of me. Remember the communion tables? Did anybody go to a church like that or have been to one? It's a little bit more traditional, but it's a beautiful saying that we see on the front. Do this in a remembrance of me, where Jesus gives the command for us to take an ordinance of communion. So today we're going to talk about the Passover or the Last Supper in the Holy Week. We were in week 3 of our series Holy Week, and just going through, we thought instead of doing just Palm Sunday and just Easter Sunday, let's take a 8-week period, and really it lines up with the Lent calendar, but we're not doing Lent, but just looking deeper into the last week of Jesus' life. And so we're going to be in Matthew chapter 26 today. I prefer the book of Matthew. I don't know why. Maybe it's just the way that he writes, but he writes more to a Jewish audience, and I think it can help us get a clear picture of what he's talking about. And so we're going to start in verse 17, and we're going to work our way through verse 29. It says, now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. And when it was evening, he reclined at the table with the 12. And as they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, "Is it I, Lord?" And he answered, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for him if he had not been born." Judas, who would betray him, answered, "Is it I, Rabbi?" And he said to him, "You have said so." Now as they were eating, Jesus took the bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." And he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until the day that I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." We are on Thursday now of the final week of Jesus' life. It started on Sunday, where we talked about the triumphal entry, where Jesus rides on the colt of a donkey into the city of Jerusalem, and they're saying, "Hosanna, Hosanna." And they're claiming him as Savior. And they're shouting out to him, this is the Messiah. They're worshiping him in that way. And he makes his way into the city. And then we go to Monday, where Jesus cleansed the temple, which Josh talked about last week and did a phenomenal job, by the way. Thank you, Josh, for speaking to us last week. And then on Tuesday and Wednesday, they're a little bit lighter days. We see where Jesus goes into the temple. He explains the cursing of the fig tree. He goes into the temple and teaches in the morning and starts to build on the tension of him. He starts to really call out the Pharisees and their belief system and what they're putting their trust in, and really starts to see this momentum continue throughout the week. And so we're going to jump ahead to Thursday here, where Jesus sets up the Last Supper, and he's just anointed at the city of Bethany by Mary. If you remember that story, you can read about it in the book of John, where Mary kneels down and she anoints his feet, and she's anointing him. It's really a preparation for burial. The Pharisees and everybody's like, whoa, that's a lot of money. We can't do that. You read that story, if you remember that Sunday school story, so to speak. And now we see the Last Supper. And so I want to give you the main idea this morning. If you're taking notes, help us kind of guide us as we're going through this morning. Jesus invites us to recline at his table to commune with him. Jesus invites us to recline at his table to commune with him. Let's look at verse 17. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?" That unleavened bread is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It was a 7-day festival that the Jews would celebrate. If you lump in the day before Passover, it was like this 8-day celebration, but really the festival was 7 days, which started on Passover. And so the disciples asked, "Where would you have us prepare?" Now, this was no small meal that during this feast of unleavened bread. There was no small task. They could have no yeast or leavened bread in their house. So they would have, during this time, they would go through all their house and collect and throw away and get rid of all the leavened bread in their house. They had to go through a process, a cleansing, so to speak, to begin this festival. You can read about this in Deuteronomy chapter 16. The prep of the meal was no small task either. They had to find a place. You imagine if there's 12 disciples and Jesus, 13 people, to gather in a room with tables around. That had to be a pretty significant room in that culture. Nobody really had a large room of a space in a house like that. But the offering and the meal had to take place inside the city of Jerusalem. So they had to prepare the food. They had to take the lamb to the temple to be sacrificed. That's called the Paschal offering. If you are into studying, you can look that up. It looks a little bit different now than it did in Jesus' time. If you know history, Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. The stones thrown over, the temple destroyed. From that time on, animal sacrifice was no longer a thing. And so what we see with a Jewish Passover meal now would not look like what it looks like then. And so, but just an understanding to help you see what this purpose of this Passover meal was. A common Passover meal would be a lamb. They had unleavened bread as a reminder that the Israelites, as they were fleeing Israel, that they left in haste. They ate in haste, fast, quick, didn't have time for the dough to rise. They had to leave quickly to get out of Pharaoh's rule and his power and his strength. And so they're leaving quickly. They're eating unleavened bread as a reminder of that. They would eat bitter herbs. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Just like it sounds like some of my cooking at times, but he's eating bitter herbs to remind them of the bitterness of slavery. There's purpose behind what they're eating in these meals. They would dip vegetables into salt water as a reminder of the Jewish tears of the slavery and the Exodus. Can you see that it's all about remembering? It's all about recalling to their mind, look what the Lord has done for you. Let's look at verse 18. He said to them, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand, and I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. Go into the city and you'll see a man. Mark and Luke give us a little bit more detail in this. And they say that you will see a man carrying a jug of water. Now to us, that seems right. It seems normal, right? It's like a guy's going to carry the heavy stuff. We're trying to be respectful of our wives and our women. You don't want them to have to carry something heavy. It's not that we don't think that you can do it. It's just respectful to us and our culture. But in this culture, a guy was not normally carrying a jug of water. It was the woman's job. If you've ever been to Mexico or Central America on a mission trip, or if you've gone a little bit outside of the touristy area, in those countries, you'll see these women, they put these big tubs on top of their head, and they're walking down the street, and you're thinking, how in the world are you not spilling that right now? So as they walk into the city, they see a man carrying this jug of water, and it was a clear sign for them, this is the man that Jesus was talking about. They found the man, told him what Jesus said, and prepared the Passover. And again, as we saw with the triumphal entry, the beauty of this story is that we continually see Jesus knew that this was his time, and he was prepared for it. He had it set up. He was ready, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get towards the cross for you and I. Let's look at verse 20. When it was evening, he reclined at the table with the 12. And as they were eating, he said, I say to you, one of you will betray me. And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, is it I, Lord? When it was evening, the Jewish calendar ran from dark to dark. If you were to go to Jerusalem today, you would see that the Sabbath. You know, the Sabbath starts on Friday evening. Doesn't start on Saturday. And so the new day starts in the evening. So when dark hits, so if you go to Jerusalem and the Sabbath is about to take place, you would see people running all over the city to make preparations in the afternoon. They're running. And then as soon as dark hits, it's like, it's a ghost town. It's only tourists walking around. And all the shops are closed, except for the Muslim quarter. And so you start to see this thing that the Jewish day starting at night, and it says he reclined at the table. Some of you, if you are an art person or you enjoy history, you might have seen Leonardo da Vinci's famously painted Last Supper. Painted in a late 15th century. I can show you a picture of it this morning. If you enjoy art, it should be in there, maybe, towards the bottom of the thing. It's Leonardo da Vinci painted this painting. It's beautiful, a lot of great detail. And it has been celebrated for years and years, but more than likely, it's wrong. Let me show you another picture. The way that this would have been set up, there would have been 3 tables in the shape of a U. And so you see this long rectangular table in Da Vinci's painting, beautiful. It's great for a picture. It's not really right. It's not really true. So it would have been more, if you go back to the other one, 3 tables in a U shape. And even this one's a little bit off, but what they would do is they would recline at the table. They would lay with their left shoulder at the table. They would prop themselves up with their elbow, and they would eat with their right hand, feet away from the table. As any good germaphobe would say, please get your feet away from the table, right? Unclean, so they put their feet away from the table. They would lean and eat. I don't know what they did if you were left-handed, but evidently you had to be right-handed. So that's a picture of what this setting would have been like, to give you an idea. Matthew, the writer that we're reading from today, skips the beginning of the meal. He skips the blessing over the meal and the Passover celebration, and he jumps right to the thick of it and right into the tension. Maybe that's why I like Matthew, because there's not a lot of fluff in Matthew. He's like right to the point. And he says, one of you will betray me. One of you will betray me. I find it really interesting. The disciples did not immediately start pointing fingers at each other. I don't know how it is at your house, but at our house, if there's a mess in our house and we don't know who made it and we ask our kids, not once have they ever said, maybe it was me. It's always somebody else's fault, right? It's always that somebody else made the mess, that destroyed or marked on the wall. We were sitting up last night and somebody decided to paint their own Da Vinci right on our wall upstairs. They're just having a good time. We don't know who it is yet. But when we ask them this afternoon, guess what's going to happen? I don't know. Maybe it was her. They start immediately asking, is it I, Lord? It's just us. In our human nature at times, we tend to look at what other people are doing, other mistakes that they have made. With adults especially, we can always notice what's going on in other people's lives and the mistakes that they've made without first looking inward at our own lives and the mistakes that we've made. We would be doing a lot better in our lives and our relationships if we start asking ourselves first, did I do something wrong in this relationship? Did I do something wrong in this friendship? That's easy to talk about, not always easy to do, is it? Verse 23. He answered, he who has dipped his hand into the dish with me, he will betray me. Verse 24, the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to the man, woe to him who the Son of Man has betrayed. It would have been better for him that if he had not been born. Judas, who would betray him, answered, is it I, Rabbi? He said to him, you have said so. This type of meal would have been served in a large dish, family-style kind of gathering. And so if you're in that kind of mode, what Jesus is more than likely not saying, he's more than likely not saying that he's going to dip the bread at the same time as I, but what he's really saying is that the betrayer is in the dinner party. He's not saying that at this exact moment. I don't believe that. I believe he's saying that if you look around, that he's here. The betrayer is sitting with us. He's among us. He's in a dinner party. In Mark's account of the Last Supper, he uses a reference to Psalms chapter 41, verse 9, that says this, even my close friend whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. To eat together in this culture was a sign of communion and friendship. That's why it was always a shock when Jesus would go to Zacchaeus' house. He's a sinner. He's the chief of all sinners. How could you have dinner with him? How could you eat with him? It's shocking. It's this moment of whoa, you're supposed to be with the righteous people. If you're a Messiah, if you're a rabbi, you can't be around those types of people. But he's saying there in verse 41, verse 9, even my close friend who I trusted, who ate bread with me, has lifted his heel against me. He has this group of misfits around him, one that will soon betray him. And doesn't Jesus do the same for us? That he invites us to recline at the table with him? Knowing all of your failures, knowing all of your pitfalls, knowing all of the mistakes that you have made and will make, but still in that moment, he still invites us. There's this invitation to come and recline with him, to recline at the table, to enjoy a meal together with him. What a beautiful picture of God's covenant-keeping grace, that he sees all of it. We as humans, we tend to hide and press down the things that are deep down inside of us, the things that nobody else knows. That you might think, man, nobody would love me, nobody would care for me if they knew this about me. And Jesus says, I already know it, but I still want you to come and dine with me. I still want you to come recline at the table with me. I want you to notice Judas's words here. He says, is it I, Rabbi? Is it I, Rabbi? Now, I don't want to make too much of this, but I think it's a point for us to look at, calling him Rabbi instead of Lord or Master. If you look earlier in the passage, you see that they start asking, is it I, Rabbi? Is it I, Master? Is it I, Lord? And then Judas says, it is it I, Rabbi. Judas' sin was no small mistake. It was no small moment. Even though that the Lord used it to bring about the crucifixion of the Lord, it was no small moment. And I know it may not seem like it in our lives at times. We live in a new covenant under grace. I understand, I get that. But sin still has an effect on our lives. We used to tell teenagers all the time, like, hey, God's grace will cover your sin, but it doesn't always cover your consequences. There will be break in relationship. There will be break in trust. That's going to happen when we sin, when we make mistakes. And sin does change us. When we get deeper and deeper into sin and we hide sin deeper and deeper, we start to see the rebellion, the rejection. See Judas saying, is it I, Rabbi? Is it I, teacher, instead of Lord or Master? I've heard it said this way, that every sin can be traced to an unbelief about God. Every sin can be traced to an unbelief about God. What are you not believing in Jesus in your life? What area are you not allowing him to be Lord in your life? It's a question for us to ask. Now, as they were eating, verse 26, Jesus took the bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink of it, all of you. Now, to most, this sounds pretty normal. When you read, take, eat, this is my body, drink this cup, it sounds pretty normal to us if you've been around church for some time. But to a Jewish person, this would have been a huge shock. This would have been a moment of like, whoa, like, Jesus, this is a lot of stuff that you're asking of us. This, I don't know. Now, if you ever go to a church and a pastor tells you to do that and you hear the drum beating in the background, you should probably leave that church, right? But as we read this and understand this in a communion context, it sounds a little normal to us. Jesus is using sacrificial language. So when the pilgrims would come to Jerusalem, they would bring the lamb to the priest. The priest would butcher the animal. They would sacrifice part of the animal to the Lord as worship. He would give the lamb back to the worshiper, drain all the blood from the animal. In no case was there to be blood in the animal. It wasn't kosher. They lived by this so much that if you were to crack an egg in a skillet or in a pan, and there, like sometimes you get that little blood dot in your egg, like, and for us, we're like, nah, scramble it, you just don't think about it. But for them, you'd have to throw that out. It wasn't kosher. You weren't supposed to have blood. And so when Jesus says, I want you to eat of my body, I want you to drink of my blood, it's no small moment. A few years ago when we were in Jerusalem, and we were in Israel, and specifically in the city of Jerusalem, we'd been eating nothing but hummus and falafels all week, and I was tired of it. I wanted something hearty. I love Mediterranean food, but sometimes you just want a burger. You know what I'm talking about? And so we're walking around the city of Jerusalem, and we find this burger. It was like this God sent, like there was like the light coming out of the sky, like placed on this, like a ram in the thicket right there. We were like, yes, Lord. So we go into this burger place, and we like, man, this smells so good. You can see the flames off the grill. You're like, I want one of those cheeseburgers where it's like, like the cheese is like coming off the side. Not just a little bit where you see cheese is like melting off the side, extra cheese. So we go up to the counter, we start to order, and guess what? There's no cheese in the place. It's like, as Americans, we're like, what do you mean there's no cheese? And like every restaurant has cheese. We were in the Jewish quarter, and it wasn't kosher to mix meat and cheese. They take it seriously still to this day. And so when Jesus said, I want you to eat of my body, I want you to drink of my blood, it's no small moment. Even if you look back into earlier in John chapter 6, when Jesus is talking about him being the bread of life, at the end of that passage, the disciples say to him, Jesus, who can understand and take this message? This is a hard message to receive. So you start to see, like, Jesus isn't just saying this like nonchalant moment. He's saying, no, I'm in sacrificial language. I am now becoming your Passover lamb. Verse 28. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's house, Father's kingdom. For the blood is the covenant. Again, Jesus using this trend throughout the Holy Week that he's the Messiah, that he's the forgiveness of sins is going to come through him now. No longer will it be through a priest or a sacrificial lamb that he's become the sacrificial lamb. He's saying that the covenant that God made with your forefathers, this is the new covenant. My blood is going to be poured out for the forgiveness of sins. That word poured out in the Greek, it doesn't mean, like somebody takes it and pours it out. It means to give oneself up. I want you to think about that for a minute. And what we have to understand through all this week and all the tension that is building, at any moment throughout the week, the Lord could have pulled out of this situation and said, okay, I'm not going to do it anymore. He could have recused himself and we would still be making sacrifices, or the system would have been totally different than what we see and understand now. No one took, I want you to hear this so clearly, no one took the life of Jesus. Jesus gave his life for you and for I. We start to see this and understand this, that he's pouring himself out as a sacrificial offering for us. Today, we're going to take communion together. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up together. And I can think of no better day for us to have communion as a church family and to celebrate and to remember all that God has done for us. Because Jesus invites us to recline at his table and commune with him. Where is it that you feel most comfortable to recline? It's at home, isn't it? You get home from work, take your shoes off or whatever your ritual is. If you have little ones, that ritual doesn't happen until like 9 o'clock because you're like running, and then finally it's like, you sit back. You don't go to a guest house. Like, I wouldn't come to your house, take my shoes off, get in your recliner and kick back and be like, thank you for inviting us over. Crazy people do that, right? Oh my goodness. But when you're at home, you feel the ease, right? You feel the relaxation. You feel the calmness. I'm going to recline for a moment. Where is it you feel at home? Where is it that you feel that comfort? And I want you to think about that for a moment, because Jesus is calling us to do the same. He's saying, come home in him. He's saying, come recline at the table with me. Here's the beauty of that. I want you to think about who is at the table. Peter, who was soon going to deny Jesus 3 times, and even though he swore, I would never do that, Jesus. Peter going to deny me. I won't do it, Lord. Thomas, who would soon doubt the resurrection of Jesus after all this is over. You have Judas, who is already in the act of betraying Jesus. Yet, Jesus, in all of his love and all of his mercy and all of his grace, so beautifully dines with him. I want you to bow your heads just for a moment. For us today, Jesus is calling us to commune with him, to rest in him. There's no more trying when we find our rest in him. There's no more trying to save ourselves when we find our place in him. We rest in him, sharing a meal with Jesus to be reminded of what he's done for us. Some of you just need to hear that. You need to be reminded of the rest that you find only in Jesus. All the toil, all the work, all the stress, all the anxiety that we find in our world, trying to provide for our family, trying to provide food, or trying to provide for the needs of those around us. You could be tired, you could be worried, you could be worn down, you just need to be reminded that the Lord's asking you to come sit at his table this morning. Find your rest in him.